showtime!
For RPGs, one of the typical priorities is getting to the max level, or getting as many levels as you possibly can. Level is usually what dictates what you can equip and what abilities you have unlocked. And more importantly, many RPGs even put a drastic damage decrease if you're fighting mobs above your level. In some cases, if you're too far out of their range, you literally cannot deal damage to them. The main goal with leveling up characters in Genshin Impact is of course to get our Ascension stat higher and as well to unlock talent upgrades. Because as we all know, if your character isn't level 90 with Triple Crown talents, then how is a random stranger who inspects your profile supposed to know that you love that character?
Shame. Shame.
So let's get to the main point of the video. Is level 90 still a trap? And I know trap might be exaggerating a little bit and using harsh language, but what I mean by trap is that you might waste resources that could be better spent elsewhere early on because other games typically want you to be max level and Genshin just doesn't reward it as much as others. So why talk about this now 2 years into the game when this topic has been fought over and discussed to death at this point? Well, the answer is simple. The answer is Sumeru and the introduction of the Dendro element. This changed a lot of things, and the importance of level 90 being one of them. Of course, with the new patch comes newer players as well, and this might be useful information to those people, but I want to talk about it regardless. So in case you're newer or a more casual player and you don't know why Dendro changed this up a little bit, it's because transformative reactions, which encompasses basically every reaction that Dendro does, with Electro being an element that benefited from this greatly. Since a transformative reactions based damage scales off your character level and your elemental mastery, that makes getting to level 90 a bit more of an important thing when you're using these as your primary source of damage, which is actually the case for a lot of characters now. And even though from what I see, Quicken, Aggravate, Catalyze, the whole Catalyze umbrella as a whole may not be considered a transformative reaction, it still functions mostly like one, just it can benefit from damage bonuses and crit. First, let's go over what every character gains from getting to level 90 and how ludicrously expensive it actually is compared to other things, because the cost is kind of what's important. A lot of people are broke and you don't want to be spending your money on a really crap damage increase. Okay, some people do. Some people just love the way their level 90 characters look and they don't like seeing them partially leveled, and that's totally fine. However, I'm more concerned with spending my resources efficiently and I want to put them where they're going to get me the most reward. And typically level 90 was not that. It was probably the last step you should take, but due to other games and how leveling typically works, it's something a lot of players do first. So let's look at a chart using our good old buddy Diluc as the example, which we are going to focus on the 80 plus to 90 level range, where his base attack goes up by roughly 23, which not bad because base stats are important. That is what all of our attack percent scales off of. However, here's the problem. Attack scaling characters have always been terribly inefficient to take from level 80 to 90. And here's the main problem with that. This base attack is a small part of the character's base attack. You also have to factor in the weapon, and in this case I'm going to use a level 90 Serpent Spine as an example because with 510 base attack it's a relatively average 4-star value. And with the weapon in mind, the attack increase from 80 to 90 goes from being a 7.56% increase down to a 2.86% increase. This isn't the stock market. A 2.86% increase? That is sad. That is so sad. But what about the cost? Well, that's where this part gets even more sad. As with everything else such as weapons and artifacts and talent levels, the final levels are the most expensive. If we're talking about a player who does not have a massive stockpile of Hero's Wits and Mora to use, they're going to need to use ley lines to get these characters leveled up. For just the Hero's Wits alone, you're going to need 421 of them, which costs roughly 1530 resin on average. 80 to 90 is going to take 172 of those, which is 625 resin, which is about 40.9% of the overall resin spent, which is also the same percentage for Mora. Mora needing 1.67 mil to get from 1 to 90, 684,000 of that going from 80 to 90, which is 548 resin or 224 resin for 80 to 90. Now that is one hell of an expensive upgrade for a very small damage increase, but that specifically is for characters to scale off of attack, which really are not the be all and end all that they once were. Now we have more defense scalers, more HP scalers, and a lot more people doing transformative reactions. It's not all melts and vapes anymore. So let's switch over to our next example, Noel, a defense scaler. Now Noel, just like every other character for basically every other stat, gets roughly a 7.4% increase to her defense from 80 to 90. I didn't test every character, but I tested around various stats on various characters, testing things like Chi-Chi's attack, Yanfei's defense, etc. Pretty much everyone is in the same 7.4 to like 7.6% range of an increase from stats from 80 to 90. It's way too tedious to check everything, but I checked around enough randomly to say comfortably that this is probably the standard. So Noel. The main difference here is, unlike Diluc, 100% 90% of Noel's main base stat defense is coming from her stats from her level, so her 7.4% is not diminished by the fact that she's also equipping a weapon on top of that. And the same goes for HP scalars, because if you didn't know, flowers and feathers are not base stats, sadly. Then of course you also have to factor in that defense percent is higher than attack percent on artifacts in both base stats and substats, so that smaller increase in defense is going a little bit further than it would for attack. So while I wouldn't say absolutely take this character's level 90 as a priority, it's always been worth more than attack scalars to do this. Now let's move over to reactions, because that's where level really starts to become one of the most important things, if not probably the most important. Much like with most of the character increases being 7.44%, the percentage increase over previous levels in this column aren't exact, but they are close enough to just say that this is that for all reactions. And aggravate and spread, of course, have a little bit different numbers, especially towards the end. When a vast majority of your damage is coming from transformative reactions, 80 to 90 is a pretty huge increase, a 27% increase in damage. Now that 27%, that is not a pure 27% damage increase, because of course the attacks and abilities that are triggering the reactions are still doing a bit of damage themselves. In some cases, a lot of damage, like in the case of aggravate and spread. But still way more impactful than just an attack scaler is getting, who is using vaporize or melt. We can also see that aggravate and spread are getting a little bit more out of their last three increases, presumably to make up for the fact that spread and aggravate are meant to augment your actual damage and then get modified by damage bonus and crit, which really makes them quite unique, and I'm enjoying them a lot. Now back in 1.6, we had a similar thing happen when Swirl got buffed. People who did build Venti were mostly building him for raw damage. Building him for Swirl wasn't really worth it. Many actually built their Sucrose for EM, but they were just doing that to buff other characters with EM. Her actual personal damage from Swirl and her raw damage wasn't that high either. Then all of a sudden 1.6 hits and everyone's Venti, everyone's Sucrose, and eventually everyone's Kazuha are all level 90 and doing lots of Swirl damage. And now we can see the exact same thing happening with Dendro characters as well. At least the ones who want to build damage, but I really think everyone's going to do is all Dendro characters anyway, because even if your team is primarily doing aggravate, the applicator of Dendro can still be applying spread as well, thanks to the way it works, unlike melt and vaporize. And finally, there is one last thing to consider, and that is the monster level difference. And thanks to Reddit user Parallaxel from a Reddit thread from basically the start of the game, we can see that when you punch the numbers into the formula, it ends up being a very negligible damage increase. But of course, there will still be the people who just want to make their favorite character as strong as possible, and if you want to take your Ganyu to level 90, then do it. There's honestly very little problem with doing it on just one or two characters, but when you start to level 90 everyone, well, that becomes a little bit of a misappropriation of resources. It could definitely be better used elsewhere. So I got a chart here that I made, and while this is not a guide, this is not just advice I think everyone should follow blindly, it's just what I'm going to do personally, and I base it off just how efficient I think getting to them to 90 is in terms of Mora versus power gain. The coding is very simple. Star is what I deem to be a character that you should absolutely 90 if you're going to play them. This is of course usually to do with defense scaling, HP scaling, or doing primarily reactions like in the case of pretty much every Animo character. Checkmark means I think you should do it if you're going to use this character, but whether or not you actually take them to 90 depends on how many resources you have and what comp / playstyle you prefer for them. A good example is Beidou. You could build her with EM, so like put a Rain Slasher on her and use her in an aggravate comp, or you could just use her in raw damage because her bounce does so much damage to multiple targets. Another example is Bennett. While he is an attack scaling character, base attack is basically 100% of his value. So if you want the most value out of him, level 90 is a bit more worth it than, say, giving him better artifacts. That's a little bit up for debate whether or not you think artifacts are important for your Bennett. I personally don't care. X's of course mean I don't think they're worth it. I mean, I'm not going to do it anytime soon, and if someone asked me for recommendations, I certainly wouldn't recommend them take these characters to 90. And lastly, the question marks means I'm kind of unsure, and I'll go over each of them briefly. For Ayato, if you have C2 or you have Jade Cutter on him, I think it's definitely worth it to go to 90, otherwise, probably not. For Jean, if you're using Sunfire, it might be worth it to take it to 90, otherwise if you're using for her C2 or if you're using for her C4, not worth it in my opinion. Razor, I'm not sure if it's worth it leaning into Aggravate at all because he does hit Electro on many attacks, or if it's just better to build him Fizz. My Razor is not exactly the best built and I don't intend on using him anytime soon. Sarah, I don't believe has the Electro application to really use Aggravate that well, so I personally wouldn't take her to 90, but I'm really not sure what the value is there. Sayu could be worth it if you use her for reactions in kind of a Mimi swirl team. Much like Bennett, Shenhe is all about attack, so technically the more base attack you have, the better for all of her massive amount of attack percent to scale off of, but that is still expensive to do. I think Raiden has the potential to be built for pure EM and just Aggravate with her skill, but honestly, that could be a little bit Mimi as well, but I think it does sound a lot of fun and also promising, and well, she's an Archon, so. Xiangling could do Burgeon, potentially. Her Pyronado has the indiscriminate AoE to do that. I just don't know if that's actually worth investing in. And lastly, Xinyan. If you build her for C6 with defense, absolutely level her to 90. Otherwise, well, you're probably not using her at all. I would summarize my thoughts here more, but honestly, that chart did it for me. There would be a lot more X's on it without Dendro and without the 3.0 update. I will say this, however. If you're a newer player, level 90 should be one of the last things you consider. It is a very expensive upgrade for what is still a relatively low damage increase compared to leveling artifacts, farming for whole new artifacts if your artifacts aren't very good, especially leveling your weapon. Leveling your weapon to 90 should be one of your highest priorities. And of course, there are characters that isn't strictly true for as well. And of course, leveling your talents, which is just one of the biggest damage increases every character has access to. Most anyway. Some don't really matter, like Venti's Burst is gonna be doing mostly swirl damage. The actual damage, not so much. But you know what does do a lot? My patrons. So check out my socials if you would like to become one, but quite frankly, I'll be happy if you just become a subscriber. Praise be to Dendro, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
Attaboy!